Okay, so I can't remember where we left off, but I believe this is it. So, I'll let you get this slide real quick, and then I'm pretty sure this is where we're actually supposed to be. So, Germany is going to be facing a war on two fronts. Okay? They developed a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, and this called for attacking and defeating France in the west, and then rushing to fight Russia in the east. Alright? Germany thought this was a good idea because most Russians lagged behind Europe in their railroad system, and that this meant that it would take longer for supplies on the front line for Russia. And so the German leaders need a quick victory over France, and things started looking good. But as they entered the outskirts of the Paris, the Allies surprised them by regrouping and attacking the Germans. And they fight fiercely for 4 days. And then after 4 days, the Germans give the order to retreat. And so this becomes probably the single most important event of the war, the First Battle of the Marne. Alright? The defeat of the Germans is going to leave the Schlieffen Plan in ruins. Alright, the Russia is now forced to invade Germany in the east, and Germany was forced to fight a two-front war. So they send troops to the east, and the Western Front is going to remain in a stalemate. And they'll be forced to dig trenches and fight. Um, over after several months of mobile fighting for the next few years of the war. One interesting thing that happened on is the Christmas truce in 1914. We have the Sainsbury commercial, where on Christmas Day in 1914 the war was supposed to be over by now. And this is one of the most poignant events in the war, and thousands of men end up laying down their arms that day. German and British men shared photos of loved ones, chocolate, cigarettes. They even played a soccer game. It's pretty amazing what all happened. Alright, so the second offensive of the war launched by the Germans Wipers. Alright, and in 1915, this is famous because it was the first time the Germans introduced poison gas as a weapon of war. And that they just determined that, and it was the Canadians that helped save the Allied lines at the Battle of Ypres, or Ypres, in the war. Alright, this is a painting called Gas by John Singer Sargent that shows Allied soldiers on the battle. Um, saying that they were being removed from the battlefield after a gas attack. So the offensive of 1917 seen as probably the most famous. So there was two Battle of Vipers. There was one in 1915, and then there was the second one in 1917. The one in 1917, because of poor leadership and appalling weather, ended up costing the Allies over 250,000 men. Many of them drowned in the liquid mud of Wipers, and it's also called the Battle of Passchendaele Jail for the city taken by the Canadians. We also had the Battle of Verdun, where in February of 1916 the Germans launched a series of attacks against the underground forts of the city of Verdun. The French see this as a battle that represents what makes France great. And this is one of the most demanding battles in the history of, well, ever. It cost the French and Germans over 300,000 men each, and another 750,000 were wounded. Also, it has the most artillery fire ever fired in a war on a town. We also have the Battle of the Somme in 1916. This was started to try to relieve the bleeding of the French at Verdun in summer of 1916 by British General Haig to try to open a second front. But it didn't work. 6 days. Now, it lasted for months, but the first 6 days and 1.6 million shells later, he orders his troops to cross no man's land in one big push. They were cut down by German machine guns. Alright, for 5 months it was halted. The British lost 419,654 men, and the German casualties were between 450 to 680,000 men. Now, a casualty is not necessarily a person's death, it could be a wound or a death, okay? But the amount of death for the British was awful. One of the worst battles ever in British history. And for 5 months, the front didn't move at all. And so this war is basically fighting over inches and whatnot, and feet. There was one major naval battle in the war. The British ended up losing more men and ships, but they were able to cripple the Germans' navy ability to travel the open seas. Alright, what about the Eastern Front? Well, the Western Front was taking thousands of lives, but both sides are still trying to send more men to fight on the Eastern Front. So there was a stretch of battlefield along the German and Russian border, where Russians and the Serbians are battling the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. This war is much more mobile in the West, but you still had slaughter, there was still stalemate, and you still see some trenches, but there was still much more movement of troops. There was one major, probably the biggest battle was the first major offensive in 1915 called the Battle of Tannenberg, where Russian forces launched a major attack on Austria and Germany. The Germans would end up counterattacking and crushing the Russian army, killing 30,000 Russians. The Russians ended up driving deep into Austria after two more wins, but then finally, in 3 months later, 1914, December 1914, the Austrians would defeat the Russians and push them out of their country. And so Russia struggles in the war. Their war effort by 1916 is over. The Tsar, Nicholas II, is struggling to fight back. They're not industrialized. Every country except Russia, for the most part, has factories and advanced and the in factories and whatnot to help make production grow. So Russia is short on everything: food, guns, ammunition, clothes, boots and blankets, all kinds of stuff. So Allied supply shipments are going to be limited by German control of the Baltic Sea. Okay? Um, they try to send extensive submarines into the North Sea and the Ottoman control of the Black Sea. But the one thing Russia had over everyone else is the numbers. Russia has the largest population. They managed to hold up thousands of German troops on the Eastern Front. And as a result, Germany is not able to fully attack the West. And so we're eventually going to see fighting spread to other areas. We're going to see fighting in Africa. We're also going to see fighting in Southwest and Southeast Asia. And by 1915, it is a world war. Also, by March of 1917, because of civil unrest in Russia, that forced Tsar Nicholas to step down. The new government ends up pledging itself to continue the war, and at this point, nearly 5.5 million Russians are killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and the Russian army have refused to fight any longer. So, 8 months after withdrawing, the communism is going to take over Russia, and the communist leader's name is Vladimir Lenin. He takes power in November of 1917, and he insists on ending Russia's involvement in the war completely. And by March of 1918, both Germany and Russia will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that ends the war between them. Well, so let's go back to the Western Front. Alright, what is trench warfare? So one of the things you'll see by 1915, all along the Western Front, they had dug miles of parallel trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. And so this is what sets the stage for trench warfare. Soldiers will end up fighting each other from the trenches. Armies are going to trade huge losses of life for small land gains. And how was life in a trench? Well, it was awful. You have mud, rats, food is practically non existent, and sleep is nearly impossible. So look at these terrible conditions. Trench foot was a common problem that was caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. Your feet would go numb, the skin would turn red or blue, and eventually gangrenous. And so a lot of people had to have their feet amputated. So what was the remedy? Well, change your socks and keep your feet dry. It's really hard to do when you're living in a ditch, especially on the Allies, because the Allied ditches were not nearly as nice as the German ones. Sergeant Harry Roberts said this about trench foot: your feet swell to 2 or 3 times their normal size and go completely dead. You could stick a bayonet into them and not feel a thing. If you're fortunate enough not to lose your feet and the swelling begins to go down, it is then that the tolerable, indescribable agony begins. I have heard men cry and even scream with the pain, and many have had to have their feet and legs amputated. Alright, so going over the top. This meant that you were going to go out and attack the other enemy's trenches in crossing no man's land. So what is no man's land? Well, this is just the space between the trenches. And so when you were ordered to attack, the soldiers would face this area, and they would have to go up against many rounds of gunfire. Well, should you stay in the trench? Well, no, because gunfire just went into the trenches as well. So what's the heck? Okay, sorry, big chowdas. Oh, barbed wire, one of the unfortunate side effects of an American product. So you can actually see, here's a trench, what a good trench looks like. They would have deep cutouts, alright, and whatnot. So a dugout was used to avoid being killed during shelling. A dugout was typically 15 deep that can hold a dozen soldiers. But the German dugouts were usually deeper. Like I said, the German trenches were so much nicer than the British ones, British and French ones. So here they even try to put mines and counter mines. Alright, soldiers' nicknames. The British were called Tommies, the French were called Frogs, and the US soldiers were called Sammies, or called Sam. But they were also called Yanks and Doughboys. The Germans were called Huns and Krauts. So military strategists were at a loss. The new tools of war had not delivered the fast-moving war they expected: machine guns, poison gas, armored tanks, large artillery, Big Bertha, airplanes, submarines. So technology is killing greater numbers of people much more effectively. The automatic machine gun. These mounted guns fired a rapid, continuous stream of bullets and made it possible for a few gunners to mow down waves of soldiers. 90% of bullet casualties in World War One were from automatic machine guns. World War One was the first major war to use chemical weapons. Mustard gas and chlorine gas were the two most popular weapons. Gases were lobbed into enemies' trenches, causing choking, blinding, severe skin blisters, or death. But a gas mask could lessen the deadliness of poison gas. Kind of creepy, even for the horses. This is afterwards, and they're going to the hospital. Even poor doggy. Alright, so the U-boat was Germany's secret weapon during the war, sank dozens of British ships, controlled the oceans. Typical World War One German U-boat had a crew of 30 and could dive to 300 feet. British did not like submarines, saw it as cheap. Air power, planes were typically used for reconnaissance, but eventually you would have actual aces that would engage in air combat, and they would attach machine guns and bombs to planes. They used them for opposition, but bombing, and eventually dogfights, which is what we call plane battles. And the greatest pilot of the war was the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. tanks were slow and clumsy.